Good morning, welcome to Insiders. They may be just numbers on a sheet of paper, but this week they made a world of difference to the morale of the coalition government. Poll figures, growth figures and jobs figures. But of course numbers can be illusory. Let's take the poll figures first. Galaxy narrowed the gap between the two parties to 6 points. But since then, Morgan has released a poll with a 16-point gap. Which one then is the road poll? We'll have to wait 9 days to find out because normal polling has been suspended for the long weekend. And that will probably come as a relief to some. And now the growth figures. As good as they were, they did not translate into positive headlines. Most of the emphasis was on the prospect of higher interest rates. Only the jobs figures came across as unambiguously good news, and yet even then, the Treasurer Peter Costello felt the need to sound a warning.
The Australian economy is not bulletproof. The Australian economy has very big risks, and the biggest risk at the moment is on such low unemployment. One miscue, one misfire on industrial relations will set off inflation and bring this all to an end. This is like a highly engineered racing car. One miscue, you take one corner a foot too wide, and it'll crash. I'll tell you what I wouldn't be doing. I wouldn't be putting an L-plate driver in the cockpit at the moment.
But of course, Paul Keating reckons he built that racing car and it's made of sturdier stuff than Peter Costello would have you believe.
The growth in the economy and the low unemployment, the reason the system is not blowing, the tinderbox is not taken off is because of the float, because of the tariff changes and because of the IR changes, structural changes. That's why they're there, not because of any superior management by Mr Costello. You know this pat line he had tonight about, you know, you wouldn't put an L-plater. God, he's the greatest L-plater of all time.
The economy and Paul Keating, subjects to the panel shortly. And our program guest this morning is Labor's Shadow Minister for Communications, Senator Stephen Conroy. Questions for him on broadband and the ABC and Paul Keating. All that coming up, but first for the latest news headlines overnight, it's Good Morning, Katrina Blowers.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning. The death toll from the severe storms in New South Wales has risen to 7, with a 29-year-old man killed when a tree fell on his car. That toll may rise to 9, with 2 other people feared dead. 6 other people have died in road accidents. Hundreds of people in low-lying areas have spent the night in emergency accommodation after being evacuated from their homes yesterday in preparation for the floods. Over 100,000 homes in the region are still without electricity. Labor leader Kevin Rudd has criticised the Prime Minister for hosting a Liberal fundraiser at Kirribilli House. At the Federal Liberal Council meeting in Sydney last week, business leaders paid $8,000 a head for drinks with John Howard at his official Sydney residence.
I don't think that's the go. When it comes to the Lodge or the Kirribilli, these are part of the national estate. They should not be used for party political fundraising purposes. I just don't think it's right.
The Prime Minister says the Liberal Party will be billed for the event. Justine Henin has won the women's singles final at the French Open in Paris. World #1 tennis player beat Serbian teenager Ana Ivanovic in straight sets, 6-1, 6-2. She's now won the title 4 times in the last 5 years and says that even she is amazed. And Barry, I'll have more news at 11 o'clock.
Katrina, thank you. And now to our studio guest, Labor's Shadow Minister for Communications, Senator Stephen Conroy. And as unlikely as it might have been just a few years ago, broadband is going to be an important issue at the next election. The details of the debate are at times almost incomprehensible to most people, but the benefits are nevertheless obvious to anybody with an internet service. Give me high speed and give it to me now. But how far apart are the major parties on this issue? Labor got in early and promised high-speed broadband to almost everybody. But the government insists it can do even better and will be announcing a policy any day now.
We will not stop at just 98% coverage, leaving the neediest Australians in rural and regional Australia without a fast and scalable broadband service. We will be able to offer affordable and metro-comparable prices to all Australians, irrespective of where they are. Labor has refused to make any commitment on affordability at all.
Senator Conroy, good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
The government won't be stopping at 98%. It seems you're about to be trumped.
Well, we welcome the fact that the Howard government, 3 months from election, have decided that broadband is important to Australians. Labor's been campaigning on it for nearly 2 years, and Kevin Rudd announced a few months ago a policy to deliver truly high-speed broadband to 98% of Australians at a minimum of 12 meg or 40 times faster than they're currently getting.
98%. She says she won't be stopping at 98%.
Well, look, it's interesting though. Government keep criticising Labor on its costings. I'll be very interested to see the cost of a 100% rollout of true high-speed broadband matching the speeds that we've committed to 100% of the population. We've said all along that the remaining 2% will get upgraded wireless and upgraded satellite facilities for those truly remote Australians, so they're getting faster broadband and as close to the speeds that we'll be delivering to the 98%.
Well, let's look at what you do have in common. You are now both committed to an open tender process.
That's right. We welcome the government going there.
And Telstra, though, has threatened to pull out, cancel its plans for the high-speed network if they don't get a decision by the end of the month. Do you think they're bluffing? Can they really afford to follow through on that?
Well, I understand Telstra's frustration at this government. They've been talking to John Howard and Helen Coonan for nearly 2 years about wanting to put in place a high-speed fibre broadband network. And yet Helen Coonan and John Howard have ignored this as an issue. And we welcome the commitment of the government now. But I can understand Telstra's frustration.
You can understand it, but if you were in government, you wouldn't appreciate them behaving in that way?
Well, we wouldn't have let it run this long. We wouldn't have waited to 3 months before an election to acknowledge that Australia is falling further and further behind its international competitors. If we want to give our children and our small businesses the best opportunities in the global world, we will need to have this sort of technology. And the fact that Howard and Coonan have just sat there for 2 years and pretended it's not an issue is just an indictment.
But Telstra seem to resent any role for the ACCC. Now, surely you would be in favour of that?
Oh, absolutely. We've made it clear that under our processes, the ACCC will be involved. The ACCC's job is to act in the national interest, in consumers' interest. We don't want to see what's been going on in this country for the last 3 months, which is secret, behind closed-door negotiations between Telstra and Helen Coonan to try and stitch up a deal that's in the government's interests 3 months before an election. The ACCC have a vital role.
Now, one other thing you have in common, both of you will use public money to some extent to subsidise the network.
Absolutely. Labor said we'll commit up to $4.7 billion to build an $8 billion national network that reaches 98% of Australians. Parity of price, parity of service. That's Labor's commitment.
But that's coming from the Future Fund. Are you sure the money is there?
Absolutely. If you look at all the estimates, the 2020 commitment by the government is easily met, even with Labor taking $2.7 billion out of the Future Fund and putting it into the equity of a profit-bearing vehicle to put back into the Future Fund.
But you're using $4.7 billion of public money. The government's planning to use $900 million to take it to remote areas. There's a very big difference in the level of taxpayers' money.
Well, the big difference here is that John Howard is championing the Telstra and Optus G9 consortium's proposal, which is only to 5 capital cities. Let's be clear. We're talking about 98% of Australians. G9 and Telstra have both said that they will only build a national network that Labor's talking about if there is government money. The $1 billion that this government's putting in is on top of the near $4 billion that Helen Coonan announced in her press release a few months ago.
But why subsidise companies for undertaking what is a very profitable business?
Well, this is the point, as I said. Both G9 and Telstra have made it absolutely clear they will not build into regional and rural Australia because they consider that to be uneconomic. They believe...
And do you accept that? Do you think it would be uneconomic for them to do it on their own?
We've always believed that a national network will require leadership from a government and an injection of public funds. We're very proud of the fact that we are taking this leadership and that we're committing the government to be a partner with the private sector in this rollout of a major piece of national infrastructure. And it's very clear that if we want to have a competitive economy with the productivity drivers, we need a national high-speed network. China's going down this path. India's looking at fast broadband. The UK, the US, all over Europe, people are rolling out fibre. They're getting into the smart economy and the benefits are extraordinary into the future.
But there was a recent poll, though, that suggested, in terms of who's to blame for the lack of progress, 33% blamed, or about a third or so anyway, blamed Telstra for that, 18% the government. Isn't that an indication that the public thinks this is essentially a responsibility of private enterprise?
Well, not from the public meetings I've been attending all across Australia. I've been in Cairns, Ipswich and Tweed Heads this week, and the cry is for some leadership. We need to knock heads together. That's why it's been 2 years since Telstra first put a proposal forward, and the government rightly rejected the initial Telstra proposal. But what we see now is just complacency on the part of the Howard government. They've been sceptics. It's a bit like climate change. They've been sceptics on climate change. They've been sceptics on broadband. Now, in the shadows of an election, they suddenly decided that they're going to get on the broadband bandwagon.
Well, speed is one thing, price is another. As I understand it, Telstra's now talking about a wholesale price, an average price of $56 a month.
That's right, but that's for the base level that you're getting at the moment using the pure copper network. I can understand that the ACCC have said that's not good enough. What we're seeing now is the benefits of Kevin Rudd's proposal and leadership in this area. We've seen speeds going up. We've seen the new VDSL technology being proposed by both Telstra and G9, and we're seeing a genuine debate about prices. The Optus G9 model is talking about an average of about $25, as against an average of $85.
Well, you're talking about the government having a bias in favour of G9. Doesn't that explain it?
Well, I can understand that Helen Coonan reached agreement with Telstra behind closed doors. It's the ACCC that stood them up. It's the ACCC that stood up for Australian consumers and said that's not acceptable. Helen Coonan and Telstra ticked off on a deal that had a price of around $85 average.
She has promised affordable and metro comparable prices to all of Australia, no matter where they live, and she says you've made no commitment on affordability.
We've said quality of price and service. In other words, same prices for speeds across the country for the 98%. Helen Coonan is talking about a wireless solution out there in regional and rural Australia. And what I say to Helen is this: are you prepared to cut off your fibre connections in your office and go into wireless for 1 month and then try and tell Australians that that's as good a service as a fibre network? You go onto wireless for a month, you try and run your office, you try and run your department on wireless and see whether or not that's the same sort of service you can get from a fibre connection.
You spent some time in Senate estimates on petrol prices recently. The ACCC really suffered quite a serious setback, did it not, with that judgment on petrol stations?
Absolutely. That was a very, in my view, a rogue judgment that took the definitions of the law and put a new interpretation on them. We had 3 or 4 companies confess to a price-fixing behaviour. You had enormous evidence of contact between these petrol stations and price movements, and yet the judge ruled that he couldn't see any conspiracy, but you had 3 or 4 of them confess.
Well, you call it a rogue judgment. What happens now? How can the ACCC get back on the front foot?
Well, I think they've made it clear that they're going to have to reassess how they can actually prosecute using the laws. And what we want to see from Graham Selmy and the ACCC is, after they've had a thought about it, whether or not they will appeal, whether or not there needs to be law changes, they're going to need to come forward, given that ruling. It was a real rogue judgment.
On the ABC, you say you want a board appointed by an independent panel, but who's going to appoint the independent panel?
Well, obviously the government of the day will appoint some independent individuals to pull together the process. They will make recommendations to the government. And
so
if the
they'll
government
stack the independent panel.
If the government rejects the recommendations, then they've got to explain to Parliament why. So we're setting up an independent process similar to that they've got in the UK, and we think this will take the politics out of the ABC board. It's too important a national institution to be continually suffering these accusations of bias and stacked boards. It's not that Labor's been perfect in the past, far from it, but this is a genuine attempt to take the politics out of the ABC board appointments and have some genuine independent people on the board.
And the chairman appointed with the approval of the opposition leader. How would that work? You
Absolutely.
Go on forever trying to find a...
Well, we would hopefully be able to put forward a candidate that was of such credibility that both sides of politics would agree on that. But that's the fundamental commitment from Kevin, and that's the challenge we put to John Howard and Helen Coonan. Will you consult, if you're appointing another chairman of the board, will you consult with the leader of the opposition? Labor's committing to, and they've got to approve the process.
Do you genuinely believe that the board sits around trying to shape the political feel of the ABC?
I think the board has an important oversight role. It's important that we understand that a board shouldn't be interfering in day-to-day management processes.
They do?
I'm not aware of it. I haven't had any allegations along those lines.
So why the concern? Because I've been with the ABC on and off for 25 years, and I've never felt internal pressure. I felt it from politicians, but not from the board.
Well, the accusation is continually made. If you came to Senate estimates and you watched the Senate estimates process, you've had the Liberal and National Party senators continually attacking the bias of the ABC, continually attacking the management, the officers from the ABC. And what we're saying is let's put in place a genuinely independent board that can give politicians and the broader community the confidence that the ABC is above politics.
Of course, they could go into the category of one of those promises that people expect you'll immediately discard the moment you've got an opportunity to exploit it.
We haven't just got to the stage of making a new announcement. We've had the Nolan principles before, the UK-based principles about selection of the board. Kevin has decided he'd like to go one step further to try and lift the ABC out of this political debate. So I don't think this is a disposable promise. This is a genuine commitment from Kevin to ensure that the politics is taken out of the ABC.
Paul Keating, do you dread seeing him on television?
No, Paul's always colourful. He's always very entertaining.
I heard that the other day. A lot of people said he was colourful, but do you think he makes a contribution, or does he simply serve to remind some voters of why they, deserted Labor 11 years ago?
Well, I think on the substance of what Paul said, as opposed to the colour and movement, I think it was a little confused. I don't think he's right across what Julia Gillard particularly is putting forward on industrial relations. I read the transcript and I didn't quite follow the points that Paul was making. And if you look at what Julia is putting forward, you'll see that we have a very, very different system than Paul seemed to think we were heading towards.
Do you think, what is his motivation? Is he protecting his legacy, or is he trying to justify why he was thrown out in '96?
I think that the economic legacy of the Hawke-Keating governments was tremendous, and he is right to point to the fact that the foundation, the bedrock of the current success of the economy largely flows from the tough reforms that were politically costly to the Hawke-Keating government. Those tough reforms have set Australia up. We've got a great little flexible economy. There are some pressures still. We've got mounting foreign debt. We've got a balance of payments that's at 6%, usually defined as an unsustainable thing. But the core reason why we're doing as well as we've done is because of those hard decisions that John Howard squibbed when he was Treasurer, that Paul Keating and Bob Hawke made.
You're from Melbourne. There's a suggestion this morning that the Prime Minister ought to have a residence in Melbourne, and some business people are trying to put together a project. I think it's sort of to try and counter the Sydney influence in politics these days, but do you think there's merit in the idea?
I do. I think that it's very important that a Prime Minister, whether they're from Queensland or Perth or from New South Wales, have a capacity to meet and hold meetings here in Melbourne. If you look at who goes to all of the Prime Minister's functions at Kirribilli that he holds, apart from Liberal Party fundraisers, if you look at who goes there, it's essentially a Sydney clique. And if we want a national leader, they have to have a capacity to meet and talk with more than just a Sydney group of people. So I support the proposal.
Perhaps Peter Costello's the answer.
Peter Costello's the answer. I want to know what the question was.
Thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks very much, Barry.
I think Kevin Rudd, he's a very interesting fellow, highly intelligent and very, very good at spin.
Kevin Rudd's come around at a good time. The Labor Party was pretty unsettled, and I think he's given them a little bit of focus and direction as to where they need to go.
Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd do make a credible team. With everything, they very much back each other up.
I think it'd be interesting to see what Kevin Rudd thinks of Julia Gillard if he gets in power in another election's time, because I think she's very ambitious and I think she wants to become the first female Prime Minister.
They're both very much the face, aren't they? You don't see anybody else apart from really those two stand up. I really don't know who a lot of the opposition are. I think if you showed people their pictures, I don't think I could name very many of them at all.
Economic side is hugely important, and I think that the Gillard-Rudd team is missing that financial whiz kid in there to argue against Costello.
Ticket numbers. I think Peter Garrett is a very good image for Labor. He draws a lot of voters across with his environmental and political views.
He brainwashed me 15 odd years ago pretty regularly, so yeah. I wish he'd make a comeback though with the Midnight Oil. That'd be great. I'd pay to see him well and truly there too.
Industrial employment reform, that's the biggest issue that could swing voters, towards Labor for those that have been affected.
You've got to look at it on a player-to-player basis. You've got Howard Rudd. Interesting matchup. You've got Gillard and Hockey. I think Gillard maybe have a nose in front there, but Hockey's doing well. I think you've got Costello and Swan. I think Costello is way in front there. I think that's a big area that the Labor Party are going to have to battle with.
Sometimes, yes, I do agree that we need some fresh thinking, but Howard has done a very good job.
Do I think people are ready for a change? Looking at the polls, you've got to say yes.
People are scared of change, and when it goes to pen to paper on voting day, yeah, they're not necessarily going to do it. They'll stick with what they know.
So, David Marr, they know about Rudd, they know Gillard and Garrett, of course, because he's a celebrity, and then they start
Not much more.
Gets a little vague after that.
Well, that's right. I mean, we're still months away from the elections. They'll be looking closer. Everybody will be looking closer as we get closer.
And I think it's sometimes overlooked that Labor's likely to have a stronger team in government than they now have in opposition. Once you add Combay, Shorten,
That's potentially
Gary
true.
Gray.
I think the government senses with Peter Garrett that he's potentially a weak link. He's in a very prominent position. Climate change is very important. He's got a high profile, so he's got the rock fans like we just heard, but he doesn't have the political savvy of some of the others, and he's been tripped up on that. I think Howard has identified that as a potential problem, and I think he's right.
But Barry, don't you think there's a downside as the election draws near and people do see more of Labor's team and talk about who may join it? Because you just named Bill Shorten and Greg Combay, two major trade union figures, which adds to the perception again that Labor, already with 53% of its front bench from the trade union members, they're seeking more and more.
But that doesn't automatically undervalue their contribution, Piers. Bob Hawke came from the ACTU and led the country for 8 years.
That's true, but it's hardly representative when the trade union movement is on a decline across Australia with under 20% national membership, and yet the Labor Party has almost 3 times that representation from this minority.
The other issue that came through there too was the time for a change thing, and the last contribution was that, well, yeah, maybe, but when you go into the polling booth, your hand might just sort of tremble at the last second. That's what John Howard is working on. He's trying to get that. Of
course. Don't put the L-plate driver into the sports car stuff.
Well, that was Peter Costello.
Yeah, of course, but that's Peter Costello is picking up and making a beautiful image of a theme that's across the government. But the other thing, of course, is that young guy saying work choices, because that's the big one, work choices.
Well, one of the interesting things is that when Paul Keating was Prime Minister and they had that recession, every group that one went to, there was somebody there who had a relation who was affected by that. They'd lost their jobs, or they had a friend of a relation, but there was an immediacy about job terminations. And during this thing about IR, I have yet to run into a person who's got a first case instance of IR affecting them, their family, or even their extended family.
Yeah, but they fear that it might.
But this is the perception that's been engendered.
Powerful.
Well, yeah, but you've had 18
People
months
vote
of
on perceptions, Piers.
David, we've had 18 months of ACTU advertising, scaremongering about this, but where is the reality? I mean, all of these people have jobs.
I reckon the other thing about the unionists and the scare about unionists, the government's been quite successful in putting down the unions. There aren't that many union members around anymore, and I actually wonder whether that means it's not resonating with people.
No,
this union
I disagree
scare.
with you there.
I wonder if it really is.
There's a community-wide apprehension about work choices that is not tied to trade unions. Of course, trade unions are feeding it, and they have a reason to, but it is a community-wide perception, which, when you look at the polling on it, oddly enough, doesn't diminish as people earn more.
People are talking about it.
This, in a very interesting way, this is not a class-based fear. It's not a working-class fear. Go right up through the middle class and higher, and people are worried about it.
But David, the polling shows that it's age-based, essentially, that the older you are, the more likely you are to be concerned about these reforms.
A lot of people aged over 18 who get to vote, Piers.
No, I'm saying that people in their mid to late 40s, 50s, 60s are the ones who are the most concerned, and the younger people who are probably on AWAs or in flexible arrangements, according to the polls, say they have the least to worry
but
about.
If the parents are telling them that they're concerned, then that permeates the younger people anyway.
We'll just hold it right there. We'll just get some background analysis now from Paul Kelly, political commentator with The Australian. Paul, good morning. What's your take on the economic figures that I referred to at the opening?
I think the economic figures we saw this week, Barry, are quite startling. I mean, they really do need to be focused on. Growth in the March quarter was 1.6%, for the year 3.8%. This is the strongest economic performance for 4 years. And it's across the board: household consumption, business investment, corporate profits, exports, productivity bouncing back. It's a tremendous story, and it's focused very much on the labour market. We saw in the last month nearly 70,000 new full-time jobs being created, and the trend there is very much to full-time, not part-time jobs. The unemployment level is down to 4.2%. So this is a tremendous economic environment for the government. It's an environment, of course, in which they will put to the Australian people, do you want to put all this at risk?
Now, that's what they'll put to the Australian people, though. Do you think it automatically translates into a political benefit?
Well, this is the big question, Barry, and we'll debate this all the way to voting day. What I'd say is this, that prosperity doesn't guarantee political victory. We know that from history. I think the government's got to be very careful the way it talks about the economy. It's got to focus on the future. It's future plans, not the past. It's got to be careful when talking about prosperity not to drift into the habit of saying you've never had it so good. And it's got to be sensitive. It's got to have I think it's got to have an eye to local situations. It's got to realise that many people have missed out, many people have fallen through the cracks, and also some community groups have not benefited the way others have, obviously. So it needs to be sensitive about that. I think the other important point to make is that with the economy this strong, interest rates will go up. Now, I think at this stage they'll go up after the election, not before the election, but this is quite a critical factor now. It clearly means that interest rates will overhang this campaign debate. Overall, I think the government's in a very good position now in terms of the best economic manager question, and this will clearly be the foundation of the Howard Costello campaign.
Now, climate change, of course, a new focus this week with the G8 coming out with a position that was similar to Labor's position, really, but the Prime Minister, we'll have a listen to him now on a familiar theme.
The Kyoto model, top-down, prescriptive, legalistic and Eurocentric, simply won't fly in a rising Asia-Pacific region.
So he's still insisting that it served its purpose, if it ever had one.
I think that's interesting from John Howard, Barry, because he told us something old and something new. Something old is that he still hates Kyoto, of course, but the new thing is he talks about the Asia-Pacific. And I think there is an emerging mood now within the Asia-Pacific region. These countries, which of course will dominate the global economy in the 21st century, these countries are now starting to say we've got to exercise a much greater influence in terms of the global debate on climate change. Now, John Howard said this week that he wants Australia to become a leader in terms of the post-Kyoto, post-2012 arrangements. In particular, he wants climate change to be the centrepiece of the APEC meeting. He wants a big initiative from this APEC meeting, which of course is in September, right on the eve of the election. He wants all these leaders here responding to an Australian government submission about climate change and agreeing to new principles, the purpose of which is all about getting the developing countries, China, India and Indonesia, somehow or other into the system. If you look around the Asia-Pacific, whether it's Prime Minister Abe in Japan, Prime Minister Harper in Canada, President Bush or John Howard, they are all moving position. Now, it's hard to work out what will be the outcome of all this, but I think the real political significance is there is a lot of activity now inside the Asia-Pacific region.
And Paul, you've written this week on Kevin Rudd's, or what he calls his education revolution.
That's right, Barry. Look, we've had a lot of focus on education in this election year. Kevin Rudd said that he wants an education revolution. We've had the Peter Costello education budget. Education's a big priority, but I think we ought to ask ourselves the question, are we going to get a better education system and better public policy in education as distinct from just more funding of education? The interesting thing we saw this week was we saw the The top 8 universities released their own blueprint for change, quite a radical document calling for a better system, saying the existing university system is not going to serve this country into the future in terms of either the funding, in terms of either the structure or the extensive degree of regulation of universities. So the university leaders who in the past opposed change are now coming out advocating change. They want a more radical change than what the politicians of either side have been prepared to commit to at this stage. I think this is good, and I think the message is that when politicians in this election year talk about education policy, we need to scrutinise very carefully what they say and ask the question, are we in fact going to get a better education system from it?
Paul, thanks for your time this morning. Back to the unemployment rate, 4.2%. The government says that it's partly due to work choices. Kevin Rudd this morning on Meet the Press was saying, well, hang on, this is part of a worldwide global trend, and he's really starting to push that line now and saying that the average in the OECD has a 5 in front of it.
It's very hard to be able to pin growth of employment onto work choices. It's very hard. To begin with, I mean, work choices has only been operating for about a year, but you just can't do it. But it's interesting, of course, for old-timers like me and peers, of course, to think...
Thanks, David.
No, well, Karen, to think back to... Do you remember when Whitlam was torn apart in the 1970s because unemployment under him went to about 2%? But this is a terrific unemployment figure. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Chifley, go back even further. Chifley was thrown out of office with full employment.
Yeah. Yes, but the point here is, quite rightly, there is a world boom. Australia is booming at the moment, and that's terrific. But you can't claim that these wonderful unemployment figures that come out of Peter Costello's office.
They are wonderful figures, and they are extremely good news. I think you also have to remember that the way we measure unemployment has changed a little bit. So there is still a small element of underemployment. So we have full employment, but people may not necessarily be working as much as they would like to.
Let me make a couple of points here. One is that last year the cry about the unemployment figures as they were dropping was that, oh, they're all part-time jobs and they're no real jobs. But as Paul Kelly just said, these are full-time jobs, 70,000 full-time jobs. So that now you know, so it's revisionism to now say, but this is a global thing. The other thing is this, that while Chifley and Whitlam had low unemployment, that's absolutely true. But being Labor, like Rudd, they claimed they were going to manage the prosperity. And we saw that they were incapable of managing the prosperity, just as we're seeing it in every Australian state at this moment.
But I think that's one of the concerns that the electorate has about the future management of the current prosperity. It's like the kind of having the party now and is there a hangover coming? You know, I think there is a little bit of a sense of, well, what have we invested, you know, what are we taking now, what have we invested now to make sure that there isn't quite as much pain coming in the future?
Well, Karen, I think that's a very good analogy. Because if you look at the way Labor governments around the country have managed the prosperity that they're wallowing in, you would say, no, you would not trust Labor federally.
Well, I wouldn't say that, Piers. I mean, that's just completely party ideology.
No, it's not, David.
Let's try and rise above it here this morning and talk about what's actually happening.
Based on the empirical evidence, you could not. You wouldn't.
No, well, you wouldn't.
Can we talk about Peter Costello's message that we ran a little earlier? What do you make of that? It sounds like a bit of a mixed message. Wouldn't you be better off going out there and saying the economy that I've built is robust, not an economy that can collapse at the blink of an eye, or if somebody...
And look, a racing car. Look, it's more like a road train. You know, there's this enormous road train of an economy tearing down a highway.
Well, it's a bit scary,
and he's talking so vulnerable.
But this is risky politics for the government. They are going negative very early. I mean, it's the same with John Howard saying it's time for a change, but it should be change for the better. Well, there's Labor's slogan, change for the better. That's what we're bringing. It is risky that if people listen to him, they say, well, actually, I think it might be change for the better. Similarly, with Costello's argument, it is suggesting that the economy is a bit precarious and not as robust as he might have made out.
Well, I think, you know, when you look at the way past treasurers have characterised this economy, Paul Keating said it was a high wire act. You know, given a high wire performer and a racing car driver, I think I'd prefer a guy with 4 wheels on the road than one bloke on a
dicing with death
with a pole.
You know, that's right.
Both dicing with death.
You mentioned Paul Keating. There's the segue. Let's have a look at some of what he said during the week, and we'll start with his attack on Kevin Rudd's staff.
They'll do him no good, because in the end, those kind of conservative, tea leaf reading, focus group-driven polling types who I think led Kim into nothingness. You know, he's got his life to repent and leisure now at what they did to him. They're back. They're back.
A former Prime Minister criticising staff. I mean, there's something that's...
The lack of discipline is spectacular, but the performance is... I mean,
the performance is
none of us could want it not to have happened. It was just marvellous.
You can't blame the staff, though, if you lose an election.
No.
This is score settling. That bit was score settling on Paul Keating's part. He has long blamed Gary Gray, who was National Secretary of the ALP, for his defeat, and he still cannot get out from underneath that. David Epstein was involved in that. He's having a go at him too. He'll have a go at the National Secretary, the current Secretary, Tim Gartrell, because he failed to, he says, make the argument on interest rates. And I think this is the other element, and this is the overriding element.
And just before you go on, we'll have a look at what he did say on interest rates and then pick up your point from there.
All they had to say is John Howard had the highest cash rate since the Second World War, 21.4% in 1982, and that whole campaign would have gone, but they wouldn't say it.
Karen?
I think he thinks they lack confidence. They lack the confidence to make the argument. I think he's angry and frustrated that they refuse to defend what he thinks is his and Hawke's legacy, and that flows through into being reluctant to make a clear argument.
Yes, and on interest rates, I think they feared that look, if the Labor Party responded, they would escalate it as an issue, but in the end, they gave it all to the government.
Well, if you have the guts to make the argument, you know, if you believe in what you're saying, you believe that you're actually right, as he says that they should, then you can get away with it. And what I think is very interesting with what we've heard this morning from Stephen Conroy, and in fact from Kevin Rudd in an interview he did this morning, is they've started doing it. They want to shut him up.
Another segue. Thank you for that. This is what Kevin Rudd said on Meet the Press this morning.
Bob Hawke, who was president of the ACTU. Under his prime ministership, and I've never been president of the ACTU, let me tell you, under his prime ministership, with Paul Keating as treasurer, we had fundamental, market-oriented economic reforms in, I've got to say, the face of a lot of opposition from the trade union movement. That is Labor's history, and we're proud of it.
Paul Keating got a result.
Yeah, Paul Keating, there you go. You've had it now. Can you just go home and stay quiet?
I think we'll hear more of that.
Barry, there are a couple of points here. One is that all of the Hawke-Keating reforms were supported by the coalition government. All of the coalition's reforms have been opposed by the Beazley, Latham, Crean, now Rudd opposition. Okay, that's one. And I think the other thing now about Paul Keating himself, as embittered as he is still the older statesman of Labor. I agree. I think it's very unfair to attack staff and blame whether Gary Gray or David Epstein for the loss. But I've also heard Paul Keating blame Wayne Goss. I've heard him blame Bob Carr.
Who haven't you heard him blame? Himself.
Yes. Well, curiously enough, he hasn't got to that. And you know, therefore, when you look at this extraordinarily intricate figure that he is, I mean, he does belong in the musical. And that's no doubt why it's so successful.
He switched to vaudeville.
Yeah, that's true.
But what a performance.
But he did, and there was some substance to it as well. But of course, probably the most damaging part of the contribution, I think, to the Labor Party generally was when he was asked to offer an opinion on Julia Gillard.
How do you think she's gone?
Not very well. Not very well. I mean, this was a very simple change. She had to put a simple thing across. Look, basically what she should have said was this. We'll register all agreements with two provisos. We will introduce a national minimum wage with conditions for annual leave, sick leave, etc. No agreement will be registered which derogates from that award. And the second condition is there'll be no positive discrimination against collective bargaining or the ability of a union to represent people. There mightn't be either positive discrimination for a union, but there won't be one against a union. Now, once you've said that, you've said the lot.
So this is what I'm talking about. You know, he's frustrated that they're not making a clear and simple argument. In fact, one of the amusing things early in that interview was he talked about the economy and he got all his usual fired up and he said, you know, it's like with these terms of trade, it's had a vodka shot and it's jumping and the dollar is rising to calm it down. Now, that's what he used to do so well, whatever you thought of Keating. Talked about when the economy was heating up that it needed to take a Valium. I think he's saying he should be hearing some more of that kind of talk.
Well, I think he spent too much time in Darlinghurst bars, David. or vodka shots. But I would say that I think that he is correct. It was quite obvious that Gillard, even though she's an industrial relations lawyer, had no understanding of the basic law that she was enunciating.
Oh, she didn't have the words.
She has struggled.
She had the words, but she didn't understand how the Australian government works.
And she struggled
to keep
to keep
have an
business
administrative and a judicial body.
Oh, that was completely ludicrous, yes.
It was completely ludicrous, and Paul Keating is absolutely correct to point out that she's a ninny.
Well, that's not the words he used, but what Keating says there about what she should have said is absolutely correct. You know, register all agreements, have minimum conditions that can't be thrown away, and don't ban unions from the workplace.
He's saying the policy is right, the argument is pathetic.
Sure,
But then when he says that's all that needs to be said, in reality, of course, then the media want a whole lot of answers to a whole lot of very complicated questions, and that's when it gets difficult. What about this last quarter scenario now that Howard off, Costello on? I got the feeling that's starting to fade as an idea. Certainly Peter Costello couldn't have been more emphatic, I thought, on the 7:30 report.
I'm going to this election as Treasurer. I'm going as part of a team with John Howard, the Liberal National Party team. That's the way I'll go to this election, and I'll go to this election working with every ounce of my ability for the Australian people to keep them in work and to keep their businesses safe. That's my focus, and that's what I'll be doing.
Makes it pretty hard to launch a challenge after that, mind you. You know, it's happened before, but I think it's unlikely. And I think this party owes John Howard so much that it's going to be extremely reluctant to ask him to move.
Barry, I don't know who was pouring this stuff around during the Liberals National Conference.
Your friend and colleague Andrew Bolt, I think.
But I don't know who was briefing this line. But it certainly didn't come from anybody of any status within the Liberal Party.
I think it's a hand-wringing. It's a frustration that things are not going as well as they should be from the government's point, and they're looking back at last year and saying maybe we had an opportunity then and we missed it.
And of course the Galaxy poll took the heat out of the thing, but in fact then a Morgan poll comes out on Friday, 58-42. Didn't get a run anywhere.
But I would like to challenge many of Mr Morgan's polls.
Well, let's see whether the next news poll is closer to Morgan than it is to Galaxy.
That is a big gap.
The thought of Costello striding in now is just completely impossible. It's just not going to happen.
Now, on climate change, the G8 has come up with this proposition of a 50% reduction by 2050. Does that mean now that the whole world faces a Garrett recession?
Well, yes, apparently all of the cars of the world are going to be taken off the road. All of the coal-fired power stations are going to be closed down. What else has got to happen? I mean, basically, back to the Stone Age.
I think that the G8 policy is rather more broad than that, and it gives particularly with George Bush saying that you have to have China and India into any
agreement. But Piers, the headline figure doesn't help John Howard's government, given the line they've been running on.
It's a target.
On the target.
It's a target.
It's a target.
But, as Bush says, and as Howard has consistently said, and this is why Kyoto is such a joke, unless you have the biggest developing nations in the world as part of the agreement, it is meaningless.
Let's talk about consistency. I mean, yes, first we had from John Howard, we can't do anything until the rest of the world moves, and now all of a sudden he's completely changed that. And he's also now talking about an Australian solution when he's previously been talking about needing the entire world. So that is not consistency.
My dear Karen, he's talking about an Australian-led solution coming from APEC, but it must embrace these major economies.
Including, of course, and fundamentally, the economy of the United States of America. All of this rhetoric about we've got to get China and we've got to get India, which is completely correct. We've got to get the United States.
That's right.
Nothing can be done.
And David, you know the reality is
States.
there will be a Sydney Declaration in September.
Yes,
it will include the United
kind.
States, India, China and the rest of them, and that's going to be a boost to John Howard.
It certainly will be, but by then, though, I think it's going to be very difficult for the coalition government to continue what is the real kind of underlying global warming panic that they're running at the moment. That if you do virtually anything, you're going to send the economy back to the Stone Age. Places like California, Arnold Schwarzenegger is proposing a 60% cut by 2050. And they're not talking about California going back to the Stone Age.
Well, I don't think Arnold will be around.
They're talking about exciting economic possibilities by dealing with global warming. And I think what we're going to see towards the end of this year is the death of that panic And that panic at the moment is very useful to the coalition.
Well, David, we've also seen in California, where that group of celebrities in Malibu knocked down the proposal for the BHP Billiton natural gas pipeline to come ashore.
Australians among them.
Absolutely. And,
yes.
and I don't think that the Californians really understand what they're doing, and I don't have that great hopes for their power generation ability.
You know, a lot of extraordinary things have come out of California.
Nuclear.
Piers.
Let's now talk about Cardinal George Pell, the Archbishop of Sydney, who intervened in the stem cell research debate in the New South Wales Parliament and got a rather interesting reaction.
Catholic politicians who vote for this legislation must realise that their voting has consequences for their place in the life of the Church.
Maybe I go to hell, but if I go to hell, I'm going to do so by saving a lot of lives, because that's what this bill is about.
And I think he's got three options. He can apologise, he can run for Parliament, or he can invite further comparisons with that serial bullhead Sheikh Al-Ali.
Now, they did defy him. There was no penance in the end for their sins, no Hail Marys.
And that's the story of the week. The story of the week is that the Cardinal got up and told them not to vote for that bill, and they ignored him. So it's an important moment in the history of New South Wales, particularly,
I think
where Labor has been very vulnerable, in particular in the old days. Now, I mean, Catholic leaders are across both parties, very vulnerable to these kinds of threats from church leaders, and it was a terrific thing to see.
I think he was right to put his position. That was perfectly right. I think he went too far when he was talking about the potential for retribution. Now, I was brought up in the Protestant church. I'm not Catholic, but my understanding of Christian teaching is that God takes all comers. So if you're starting to suggest that God will pick you off because of a position that you take, you're getting onto dangerous turf, and I think that's where people were offended.
That's the point you make. Like Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott have both made the point that he had every right to speak out. But doesn't that miss the point? He did more than that. He tried to direct them on how to vote, and he warned of consequences if they didn't vote according to his wishes.
He warned that they would be struck down, and I think that's what people had a problem with.
Oh, Karen.
He did, effectively.
He did.
No, he did not effectively warn that they would be struck down.
What were the consequences?
He's talking about...
The consequences were that it would have consequences for their place in the church.
Their relation, as the leader of a church, he's talking about his relation, or their relationship with the church establishment.
No, not their relationship, their place in the church.
Their place in the church.
Well, the structure.
And that means their salvation.
That's effectively the extension of the argument.
And Pell commended the language of the Archbishop of Perth, Hickey, who talked directly about excommunication.
And he also talked about the Anglican Archbishop.
Yes, of course, but the Anglican Archbishop made a point of saying he wasn't going to threaten people with consequences for their life in the Anglican Church. Pell went further, and this is a fashion that began, of course, in the presidential elections in America last time round, where John Kerry was directly condemned by a couple of powerful archbishops there who said that if he tried to take communion in, I think it was Chicago, he wouldn't get it.
This on abortion.
This was on choice, pro-life and pro-choice. And this, in America, this is another fashion from America creeping over into the Australian church. And it's thuggish. We don't want it from imams, we don't want it from cardinals, we don't want it from archbishops. Well, they've got to take a prominent part in the public debate because it's an important ethical debate.
David,
but no threats, please.
But the church has a structure, just as Collingwood Football Club has a structure.
Very similar.
And, well, I'll defer to the bishop here. But if you opt to belong to an organisation or a club that has a structure, and then you say that you want to be in that club but you don't agree with its rules...
Piers, you're not saying, Piers, are you, that Catholic members of Parliament have to vote according to the Vatican's directives?
No, I'm saying that...
Are you?
I'm saying that they have to examine their relationship with the structure.
Well, and do they have to examine their relationship with God, which is what he sounded like he was really saying.
We'll have to leave it right there, Karen. Karen Middleton, David Barr and Piers Ackerman. We'll be back in a few minutes, but time now for Mike Bowers and his regular segment, Talking Pictures.
I'm Michael Bowers and I'm pictorial editor with the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm talking pictures this morning with the independent member for Calare, Peter Andren. Welcome to Talking Pictures, Peter.
Hi, Mike.
Well, you've maintained a reputation for being a fiercely independent member of the House since you were first elected in '96.
Well, I was the news editor at Prime prior to that, Channel 8, and when the opportunity came for having a run at the seat, it was suggested that I do, and I said, what as? I've never belonged to a political party.
You find yourself with the other independents on a lot of issues. I think this one was the press conference saying no to the sale of Telstra, which you were very strong on.
We, in fact, were representing the anger of regional Australia, and it still exists, about the fact that they've been dudded big time. They're not going to get anywhere near parity of service out of a privatised telecommunication system.
Is it hard to stand against the entire Parliament at times? You must feel like you're sort of the lone voice there on occasions.
Look, I've got over that long time ago when I was given the flick out of Parliament back in '97 for daring to suggest that we table our travel allowances and was, accused of smearing my colleagues by the PM.
Tanberg picked up on it, Peter, and he's got you being kicked out here. The cheek of him coming in here representing the mob. It was a beautiful little take on what happened to you.
It was. I love it.
This was back in '96 after Pauline Hanson gave her maiden speech, and you used to be seated right next to Pauline.
I was concerned at that time that Pauline and Graham Campbell and others were cooking up a party. They made no secret of it.
Yeah.
And I thought, I want out of here.
Peter's another Ward O'Neill where he's got the Prime Minister trying to euthanase you with the J. Howard Democratic Euthanasia Kit. This was done during when you tried to move an amendment to the war in Iraq, is that right?
Yeah. And it was all around a time when I'd also become involved in the debate over plastic bags and so on, and moved to join. So I think Ward's combined a few images there.
Run us through what this one's about, Peter.
Well, we were trying to get a motion up on the Iraq War. Now, John Howard had moved a motion to the Parliament saying how much we supported our troops and what a great thing it was going to Iraq. Now, I wasn't about to deny the appreciation of our troops' effort, but I added a little rider saying, notwithstanding all of the above, we must not commit ourselves to Iraq without the specific endorsement of the UN Security Council.
And this one where he's sort of saying you are the balance within the Parliament.
Well, he's also got a barbed wire fence running through my legs too, which suggests that it is a fairly
prickly issue. We'll watch your race for the Senate in the upcoming election with some interest.
Thanks, Mike. Pleasure.
Cheers.
Now, Glenn Milne's story in the Telegraph this morning. Kirribilli House was used as a fundraiser for the Liberal Party during the Liberal Council meeting. They charged business people something like $8,000 a head to turn up there. Now, there's no precedent for this, is there?
Not that I can think of. I mean, it is a very difficult thing. I mean, is a Prime Minister entitled to bring some mates over for dinner?
Yes.
And then what's the extension of that? The charging of the money makes it a slightly different arrangement. I'm uncomfortable with it.
Goes. I mean, if you're raising the money for charity, fine.
And he has done that, he has used the house for charity.
This was to raise money for the Liberal Party.
Yeah, yes. Barry, but you worked for Hawke. In Hawke's days, or even in Keating's days, surely there must have been major financial backers of the Labor Party who were invited.
I think I can say without fear of contradiction, Pierce, that not once was any of the Prime Minister's residences used for a fundraiser for the Labor Party.
But do you feel that by being glad-handed at the official residences, it might have loosened their purses?
But this is a very different situation. They were actually charged $8,000 with the clear knowledge that the money was going to the Liberal Party to spend in an election campaign.
Is it different if they'd had the dinner at the Western Hotel and charged them $8,000?
Of course it is. Yes, it's the use of Kirribilli House. It's not the Prime Minister's house to use in that way.
And in the United States of America, of course, the use of the White House for fundraising is specifically forbidden by law.
And the Clintons got into bother for having people overnight on
overstays with the understanding that there'd be sleepovers, that there would be a big check in the morning.
A lot of presidents have had their contributors and so forth to the White House.
The law in America recognises an important principle here, that these residences belong to the state and they have a purpose that is not party political in this way. Now, you've been invited to Kirribilli House, but I presume you've never had to pay to go.
Now,
Correct.
What the government...
By neither Labor nor Liberal Prime Ministers.
What the Prime Minister is saying, or at least his office is saying now, that the Liberal Party is going to be billed for the use of the building. Now, how do you work that out?
Is that only because a story's been written about it?
I don't know.
Would it have been billed anyway?
I just have this thing. The Parliament House in Canberra is a state building. It's owned by the people of Australia. And yet every party has paying guests to Parliament House. Is there such a difference between an office, a reception at Parliament House that you buy a ticket for?
Piers, you're endorsing the practice, and I just find that surprising.
I'm questioning it.
No, are you endorsing it, though?
Are you endorsing it?
Sounds like you're endorsing it to me.
Do you reckon fundraisers should be paid money to go and have a meal with the Prime Minister at Kirribilli House? If so, say so.
If the party is picking up the cheque, I don't object to it.
Yeah, well,
all right. Fine.
Now, Kevin Rudd walked out to a news conference during the week and volunteered some comment on a fresh troop deployment to Afghanistan, and of course there was no such thing. He was given poor advice, and this is what happened next.
Can I add one other thing on something I've just told before I came on to speak, and that is I understand Mr Howard has just announced a deployment to Afghanistan. Are you aware of this? A further deployment of 300 troops. We've just received that information. As you know, our position as the alternative government has always been to support our military engagement in Afghanistan.
Now, why did he get caught out on that?
Well, because there was a defence briefing in Canberra, which happens every month. Sky News was broadcasting it. They clumsily summarised at the bottom of their screen that there was a reference to 300 troops to Afghanistan. It was a reference to the troops that have just gone. Kevin Rudd's staff saw that. He was about to do a news conference in Brisbane. They rang through, oh, there's a new deployment. They should have known better, because if there was a new deployment, the Prime Minister would have announced it, not Gus Gilmore in Canberra. And he thought, oh, I'll get in on this. I must make sure I'm in on the news cycle, and clumsily said what he said. And you could see that he wasn't even quite sure. He was saying, have you heard about this? It was very embarrassing.
It wasn't a Rove moment, but nevertheless he should have checked more carefully.
He should have done a lot better than that.
It's kind of ironic, because he is the master of the deflecting questions by saying, I'm sorry, I can't comment on that because I haven't been briefed. So for him to flip over and do that, it was a big mistake.
Kevin Rudd has been running around the country trying to preempt everything that the government is about to announce. and he's been caught out before, particularly with dams and pipelines in the north coast of New South Wales. But what I think this actually reflects is the problems with his own office. You know, he's been casting around for a chief of staff for a long time now. David Epstein's been given the job, but he's the third person who I know personally who was offered this job. And I think that until things settle down in his own office and he gets a handle on it, we will see more of this sort of
Just what Paul Keating was saying.
Yeah, but I go back to the point,
he's
though,
a statesman, David.
That you can't blame your staff for your own performances in the end.
You're responsible for it.
And to be fair, Kevin Rudd did not publicly when he was asked about that, because it was the same day. It was the same day as the Paul Keating stuff emerged, and he's saying, "I'm not blaming my staff." It's
now,
my problem.
Joe Hockey's Shrek performance, just in case you missed it or you want to see it one more time, here it is.
I'm Princess Fiona, okay? Oh, Shrek! Now my employer knows I'm pregnant. He's giving me fewer shifts. What are my rights under the new Australian Workplace Agreement, Shrek?
I'll protect you, Fiona. I'll protect you. It's unlawful, Fiona. The good government is going to rescue you, Fiona.
That deserves applause. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen.
Just shocking.
I loved it. I thought it was great. Actually, I think Joe Hockey is a lot more comfortable performing like that than having to kick heads and thump the table. He's not comfortable with the negative.